In the winter of 1862, a stranger rode into a small Ozark community on a tired horse, carrying a Bible and a smile that made people feel seen for the first time in years. He knew exactly how that would feel. He had been counting on it. What this man did inside that isolated mountain hollow over the following months was methodical, calculated, and very nearly perfect. But he didn't work alone. There was a woman who arrived 2 days after him. She knew exactly what he was. The question is, what she was going to do about it, and when it was already too late. The autumn of 1862 arrived in the Ozark Mountains the way it always did, quietly, without announcement, slipping through the trees like a secret whispered between old friends. The maples turned first, then the oaks, and by mid-October, the hills above Clearwater Hollow were draped in colours so vivid they seemed almost indecent against the grey permanence of the sky. Women hung laundry between the pines and called their children home before dark. Men who were still there, the old ones, the lame ones, the lucky ones who had managed to stay, split wood and repaired fences and tried not to think too hard about the boys who hadn't come back yet from places with names that meant nothing to them. Pea Ridge, Wilson's Creek, names that had arrived on paper and stayed there, pressed into memory like dried flowers. Clearwater Hollow was not a town in any formal sense. It was a gathering of lives, 7 families clustered along a creek that ran cold and clear through a valley enclosed on 3 sides by forested ridges so steep that sunlight reached the valley floor for only a few hours each day. There was a mill, a general store that smelled of tobacco and damp grain, and a small whitewashed church that served as school, courtroom, and meeting hall, depending on the season and the need. The nearest town of any consequence was a 2-day ride north, and most people in Clearwater Hollow had not made that journey in years. They did not need to. They had each other, and they had God, and they had the mountains. And for most of their lives, that had been enough. It was on a Tuesday morning, during a light rain that couldn't decide whether to stop or continue, that Elias Blackwood rode into the hollow on a brown horse that looked as tired as the man sitting on it. He came down the ridge trail from the east, which was unusual because most strangers came up from the valley road, and his arrival was noticed first by young Thomas Hale, who was repairing a fence post near the tree line and stopped his work to watch the rider descend. The man was dressed plainly, a dark coat worn soft at the elbows, a wide-brimmed hat beaded with rainwater, and he carried no visible weapon, which in 1862 in the Ozarks was itself a kind of statement. Across the saddle behind him was a leather satchel and what looked like a Bible tucked under one arm, thick and dark with use. He stopped at the edge of the road and looked around the hollow with the unhurried patience of someone who had arrived exactly where he intended to be. When Thomas approached him, the man smiled, and it was the kind of smile that did something specific to people. It made them feel immediately that they had been recognized, truly seen, in a way they couldn't quite explain afterward. "I wonder if I might trouble you for some direction," the man said. His voice was low and carefully placed, like a hand set gently on a shoulder. "I am looking for the church. I've been told there is no minister here at present." Thomas confirmed it. Reverend Cole had left for Springfield the previous spring and had not returned. People had managed Sunday services among themselves since then, passing the Bible around, reading what they remembered. But it wasn't the same. There was a hunger in Clearwater Hollow for something to hold on to, for someone to stand at the front of that whitewashed room and tell them that God had not forgotten this valley, that the war would end, that the dead were somewhere better than the fields where they had fallen. Elias Blackwood introduced himself as a traveling minister, formerly of a congregation near Fayetteville, Arkansas, displaced by the fighting, now moving through the mountains wherever he was needed. He had letters of introduction, which he produced without being asked, carefully folded documents written in a firm, educated hand that referenced a congregation and a bishop, and used the kind of precise theological language that signaled real learning. Thomas could not read well enough to scrutinize them, but they looked authoritative, and the man holding them looked sincere. And that was enough. By evening, Elias Blackwood had been introduced to every family in the Hollow. He ate supper at the Hale table and complimented the cooking with a specificity that felt genuine. He sat with old Walter Marsh, who had been in pain since his back gave out in the spring, and prayed over him quietly, one hand resting on the old man's shoulder, speaking words so soft that only Walter could hear them. Walter wept, and it had been a long time since anyone in that hollow had seen Walter Marsh weep. The woman who arrived 2 days later, travelling on foot with a single cloth bag, was introduced by Blackwood as a widow from his former congregation, a woman named Clara Reed, whose husband had died at Wilson's Creek. She was perhaps 32 or 33, with steady grey eyes and a composure that could be mistaken for coldness, but was, people decided quickly, simply the stillness of someone who had survived more than her share of grief. She was useful in ways that mattered immediately. She could read, she could cipher, she could sit with a sick child through the night without complaint, and she baked bread that people talked about for days after eating it. Together, Blackwood and Clara moved through the hollow like something the community had been missing without knowing it. He preached on Sundays with the kind of plain, direct power that reached people who had grown suspicious of ornamentation. She organized. She listened. She remembered every name and every trouble mentioned in passing and brought it up again later in ways that made people feel held. And yet, on the third Sunday of his preaching, Blackwood delivered a sermon on Matthew 7, the passage about wolves in sheep's clothing. He spoke about it with a familiarity that bordered on expertise, unpacking every phrase with a calm precision that should have been illuminating. But some people, if asked to describe the feeling it left in them, would have struggled to explain why a sermon about recognizing deception had made them feel somehow more trusting of the man delivering it, rather than more alert. The feeling was subtle, and it passed quickly, buried under the warmth of the singing that followed, and the smell of wood smoke, and the relief of having someone at the front of the room again. It was only Hannah Pruitt, a widow of 40, who had lived alone on the East Ridge since her husband left for the war 2 years ago and had not written since, who mentioned to her neighbour on the walk home that she thought there was something behind the preacher's eyes that she couldn't name, something that watched rather than felt. Her neighbour told her she was tired and probably needed to eat more. Hannah did not mention it again. That night, in the small room they had been given at the back of the church, Blackwood sat at the narrow table by the window with a candle burning low and a small journal open in front of him. He wrote in a hand that was nothing like the letters of introduction he carried, cramped and precise, cataloguing details with the thoroughness of an accountant. Hannah Pruitt, East Ridge property, no husband, no family within the county, substantial timber on the land, deed held in her name since the husband's departure. Cautious, will require more time. Clara sat on the edge of the cot across the room, watching him write. She had removed her bonnet, and her hair was loose, and she held her hands in her lap with a stillness that cost her something. "The Pruitt woman," she said quietly. "She looked at you differently than the others." Blackwood did not look up from the journal. "I know," he said. She's careful. Most careful people, he said, dipping the pen, have something they're afraid of losing. Once you know what it is, they're not careful at all. Clara looked at the candle flame for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. Elias, she said. He looked up then. His eyes in the candlelight were perfectly calm, attentive, the same eyes that had made Walter Marsh weep with gratitude that afternoon. Go to sleep, Clara, he said, and returned to his writing. She lay down on the cot and stared at the ceiling, and did not sleep for a long time. By November, the Hollow had fully accepted them. This was not something that happened in a single moment, but accumulated in the way trust always does, through small consistencies that stack quietly until the foundation feels permanent. Blackwood was present at the birth of the Calloway baby when the father was away and the midwife couldn't be reached in time. He sat with Ezra Holt through the fever that nearly took the old man in the second week of the month, reading aloud through the night from the book of Psalms in a voice so steady it seemed to regulate something in the room. He adjudicated a dispute over a property line between the Macready and Dunbar families with a patience and fairness that left both parties feeling they had been heard, which was rarer than most people admitted. Clara moved through the community with a different kind of skill. She gathered information the way a careful gardener collects seeds, gently, without apparent urgency, storing everything for later. She knew which families had money hidden and which had debt they were ashamed of. She knew which women were lonely and which men were proud, and which combinations of those qualities made people vulnerable in different ways. She passed this knowledge to Blackwood in the evenings, always quietly, always in the particular tone they had developed between themselves that was efficient and neutral, and carried underneath it something that was not quite warmth and not quite fear, but lived in the space between. Their relationship was not something the community could have categorized easily if they had been able to observe it. There was no tenderness in it, not in the ordinary sense. He did not look at her the way men looked at women they loved. She did not defer to him the way women deferred to men they trusted. What existed between them was something older and more functional than affection. A shared architecture of purpose. A mutual understanding of roles that had been established long before Clearwater Hollow. But the architecture had developed cracks. It was on a Wednesday evening in late November that Clara first understood, with the particular cold clarity of a fact finally accepted, that she was afraid of him. They had been sitting at the table after dark, reviewing a list of names in the journal, when Blackwood stopped and looked at her with the full, unhurried attention he usually reserved for congregation members he was in the process of winning over. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said that she had been distracted lately, and that distraction was a luxury neither of them could afford. Clara kept her voice level. She said she was fine. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, not roughly, not with any obvious threat. The gesture looked, to any hypothetical observer, like comfort. But his hand did not move after it landed, and the pressure was just slightly too much. And his eyes remained exactly as calm as they always were. And Clara understood in that moment that the gesture was not comfort. It was a reminder. "I need you present," he said. "You understand that?" "Yes," she said. "Good." He removed his hand and returned to the journal. She excused herself shortly after and walked outside into the cold. The stars were very clear over the ridgeline, indifferent and innumerable, and she stood in the dark for a long time, breathing the pine-cold air, and thinking about the first time she had made a choice that led her here, and how each subsequent choice had felt like logic at the time, and how the sum of all that logic had produced something she could no longer describe as a life she had chosen. 3 days later, Blackwood began paying particular attention to Hannah Pruitt. He visited her on the pretext of delivering a pamphlet of scripture passages he had copied out for members of the congregation who lived alone. He stayed for 2 hours. Clara, who had watched him leave, spent those 2 hours at the church, mending a coat that did not need mending, and trying to identify the precise boundary between what she knew and what she was responsible for. December arrived with a cold that settled into the valley like a permanent tenant. The creek ran slow and dark under a thin shell of ice, and people stayed indoors as much as they could, burning wood they had been rationing since October and praying the winter would be short. The war felt very far away in weather like this, which was both a relief and a source of guilt for people whose sons and brothers were sleeping in mud somewhere south of them. Blackwood's visits to Hannah Pruitt continued through the first week of December. He was transparent about them, mentioning them to others as pastoral care, concern for a woman alone in a difficult season. He asked the community to pray for her, framing her solitude as a vulnerability that required collective attention. This was, Clara recognized, a maneuver of some elegance. By making Hannah's situation visible and framing his attention as a communal act of charity, he simultaneously legitimized his access to her and insulated himself from any suspicion that might arise if she were to disappear. The community would remember that everyone had known he was visiting her. That was not what suspicion looked like. She watched him do this and understood every layer of it, and said nothing. On the 12th of December, Blackwood spent an evening alone with Hannah at her property on the East Ridge, returning after dark with mud on his boots and a particular quality of stillness around him that Clara had learned to read the way a navigator reads weather. She was sitting by the fire when he came in, and she looked at his face and then looked away. "She's going to give you access to the deed," Clara said. It was not a question. "She already has." He removed his coat and hung it on the hook by the door. "She's going to have it transferred next time she goes to town. She thinks I'm going to help her manage the property while the war continues. She's going to leave it in my name for safekeeping." Clara stared at the fire. "Elias," she said. He sat down across from her. The firelight made his face look warm in the mechanical way that firelight makes all faces look warm, regardless of what lives behind them. "Say what you're going to say," he told her. "She has a son." "He's in the war, but he's alive. She had a letter last month." "I know." "When he comes back, if he comes back." The silence between them was very long. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. "I can't keep doing this," Clara said. The words came out quieter than she intended, which made them sound more honest than she had planned. Blackwood looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, which was itself unusual, because she had spent years learning to read him. There was something in his assessment of her in that moment that felt different from the calculation she was accustomed to. It felt like a recalibration. "You've been saying that since Kentucky," he said finally. "And yet here you are." She didn't answer. "You're here because you know what the alternative is," he continued, without cruelty, simply as fact. "You're here because your name is in 2 county ledgers as a witness to transactions that a court would find very interesting. You're here because you have no one to go back to and nowhere to go back to. I didn't make those things true, Clara. They were true before I met you. I simply noticed them." She looked at him then, And for a moment, something moved in her face that was beyond calculation, something raw and ungoverned. And then she pressed it down, and it was gone. "What are you going to do to her?" she said. "Nothing irreversible," he said, "until spring." He stood, picked up the journal, and went to the back room. Clara sat alone by the fire until it went to coals. She thought about Hannah Pruitt's steady, watchful eyes and the particular quality of her fear when she had looked at Blackwood that first Sunday. A fear she had named correctly and then been talked out of by people who could not afford to believe her. January came in hard and stayed that way. The snow on the upper ridges was deep enough to close the eastern trail entirely, and for 3 weeks the hollow was more isolated than it had been in years. This suited Blackwood perfectly. Isolation had always been a condition he worked in rather than against, and the enforced proximity of a community sealed in by weather accelerated the processes he was managing. People confided more in winter. They sat closer together. They accepted comfort more readily because the cold made need more undeniable. He had, by mid-January, secured Hannah Pruitt's trust to a degree that made Clara sick when she considered it carefully, which she tried not to do. The woman had given him a key to the church strongbox where she kept her important papers. She had named him, in a letter she wrote to her son, as a man of genuine character, someone to consult if she needed guidance. She had, in other words, handed him everything, without knowing she had handed him anything. But Clara had begun doing something she had never done before in all the years of their association. She had begun keeping her own record. It was a small thing, modest in appearance, a few folded pages of paper tucked inside the lining of her winter coat. On them, she wrote names and dates and details, not in her own handwriting, which Blackwood knew, but in a deliberate variation she had practiced until it felt natural. She wrote about Clearwater Hollow, about the Pruitt woman, about the names from the journal she had memorized over the years. She wrote about a family in Arkansas she had never spoken of aloud. She wrote carefully and precisely, the way he had always written, because it was the only methodology she trusted, having learned it from him. She was not certain what she intended to do with these pages, but she had come to understand, over the long, cold nights of January, that Blackwood had made a strategic error. Not in his management of the community, which remained precise, but in his management of her. He had told her, months ago and in various ways across many years, that she was necessary to him. And he had said it in the same tone he used for everything, the calm, assessing tone that processed the world as a series of problems with solutions. But what he had failed to account for, Clara thought, sitting alone in the church with the cold pressing through the walls, was that necessity was not the same as safety. The moment she understood that she had become, in his accounting, a liability rather than an asset, would be the moment he would move to resolve that liability. She had watched him resolve liabilities before. She knew precisely what that looked like. The question was timing. She got her answer on the 23rd of January. She found the journal open on the table, which he had never done before. He was meticulous about the journal, always closing it, always placing it in a specific pocket of the leather satchel. But he had left it open, and she stood looking at the open pages for a long moment before she understood that this was not carelessness. Nothing Elias Blackwood did was careless. The open page held 2 entries. The first was about Hannah Pruitt and the expected timeline for the property transfer. The second was about Clara. It was written in the same clinical tone as every other entry, cataloguing her recent behavior, the distraction he had noted, the question she had asked about Hannah's son, the way her usefulness had been declining, relative to her awareness of accumulated information that could become a problem. The entry ended with a date. February. Clara closed the journal and placed it back exactly as she had found it. She went to the window and stood looking out at the snow on the ridge and breathed slowly and deliberately until her hands stopped shaking. She had perhaps 3 weeks. She could not go to the community directly. She understood this with the practical clarity of someone who had spent years learning how trust worked and how it failed. If she walked into the Hale household or sat down with Ezra Holt and told them what she knew, they would not believe her. Not immediately. And any delay was something Blackwood would detect and respond to with a speed she could not match. He had more credibility in this hollow than she did, had built it more carefully and over a longer period. And she had helped him build it. She had stood beside him in the church and corroborated his character with her presence and her labor and her careful friendship with every woman in that valley. She had, in the language she now understood too precisely, been part of the construction of the trap she was now inside. What she could do was write letters. She had 2 envelopes and stamps she had kept in the lining of her bag since Arkansas, a habit of preparedness she had never been able to explain to herself, but which now felt like the one intelligent act of some earlier, barely conscious version of herself. She wrote 2 letters in the deliberate variation of her handwriting. One was addressed to the county sheriff in the town 2 days north. The second was addressed to a circuit judge whose name she had seen in legal papers during a transaction in Tennessee 3 years ago, and whose name she had memorized, a habit she had developed without understanding why. She wrote with the careful precision of someone who understood that a letter which asked to be believed had to first demonstrate that it already knew more than belief required. She did not claim innocence. She was explicit about her own role. She catalogued names, dates, locations, and described the nature of Blackwood's methods with the kind of detail that could only come from sustained proximity. She described what she believed was about to happen to Hannah Pruitt. She described what she believed was being planned for herself. She described where to look and what to look for. Getting the letters out of the hollow was the problem. The Eastern Trail was still closed. The Valley Road was passable, but Blackwood monitored movement carefully, and her absence from the church for more than an hour in daylight would be noted. She needed someone she could trust with a task, without explaining the task in full. Someone reliable enough to carry letters to town without asking questions or mentioning it to anyone. She chose Thomas Hale, the boy who had first seen Blackwood ride into the hollow in October. He was 15, steady and discreet in the way that boys who had grown up in families diminished by war sometimes were, older than their years in the specific way that grief produces. She gave him the letters on a morning when Blackwood was at the Pruitt property, and told Thomas they were correspondence she needed sent to relatives in the north, who did not know where she had ended up. She told him to say nothing to anyone, not because it was a secret, but because she did not want to trouble Reverend Blackwood with other people's worries, when he had enough of his own. Thomas took the letters and rode north that same morning. Clara spent the 4 days that followed moving through her ordinary routines with a care that cost her more than anything she had ever done. She cooked and mended and sat with the congregation and listened to Blackwood preach and laughed at the appropriate moments and said the right things to Hannah Pruitt when they sat together after Sunday service. She watched Blackwood watch her and matched every observation he was making with a performance carefully calibrated to what he expected to see. She was, in those 4 days, better at the work he had taught her than she had ever been while doing it for him. On the evening of the 5th day, she saw a rider on the Valley Road from the church window and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for 3 weeks. The sheriff came with 2 deputies and a county magistrate, which was more than Clara had hoped for, and less than the situation probably warranted. They arrived on a Tuesday morning, just as Blackwood was returning from the Pruitt property, and the timing was almost precise enough to be elegant. He saw them from the ridge trail, and for a moment, just a moment, visible to anyone who happened to be watching, he stopped. Clara was watching from the church doorway. She saw him stop, and she saw him calculate, and she saw him understand. He did not run. She would think about that for a long time afterward. He did not run, which was either confidence or recognition that running was no longer a viable option. Or perhaps, in that strange way he had of processing the world, simply an assessment that resistance was inefficient. He rode down to meet them with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything, and when the sheriff addressed him by 2 names, Elias Blackwood and Jonas Reed, he answered to the second without visible surprise. The community gathered the way communities gather when something they cannot yet name is happening in front of them. They stood in the cold, watching the deputies search the church room and remove the journal and the letters of introduction and a metal box from beneath a loose floorboard that Clara had not known about and whose contents she could not see from where she stood. Hannah Pruitt stood near the back of the gathered crowd. When they brought Blackwood out in restraints, she looked at him with an expression that Clara watched carefully. It was not anger. Not yet. It was the particular look of a person trying to reconcile 2 completely different people who have turned out to occupy the same face. The magistrate interviewed Clara at length that afternoon. She answered everything. She had decided, sometime in the long, cold nights of January, that the only version of honesty left available to her was total, because partial honesty in this situation was simply a slower way of being destroyed. She told him about Arkansas and Tennessee and the family she did not name in the letters. She told him about the metal box, about the documents and the methodology, about the journal entries and what the date in February had meant. She told him about her own role in the construction of trust in Clearwater Hollow, and she did not soften it. The magistrate was a man named Cornelius Webb, approximately 60, with the practiced patience of someone who had spent decades hearing versions of human failure. He did not express disgust, and he did not offer comfort. He listened with the same systematic attention she had described in her letters, and at the end of it, he told her that her cooperation would be considered, that the letters had already been forwarded to courts in 2 other states, and that whatever came next would depend significantly on what those courts decided. Jonas Reed, who had called himself Elias Blackwood, was transported north under guard the following morning. The community came out to watch him go. He was calm, composed, sitting straight in the back of the deputy's wagon, with his hands bound in front of him, and as the wagon moved past the gathered faces, he looked at each one with that same quality of attentiveness he had brought to every conversation, as if he were still cataloguing, still filing information away for some future use that he had not yet identified but was already, somewhere in the architecture of that remarkable and terrible mind, beginning to construct. Clara watched the wagon until it disappeared around the bend in the valley road. The trial took place in the spring, in a county courthouse 2 days north, in a room full of people who had traveled from 3 states to witness something that newspapers had begun calling, with the Gothic enthusiasm of the era, the case of the Mountain Deceiver. Jonas Reed sat through the proceedings with the cooperative neutrality of someone who had accepted an outcome without agreeing to be diminished by it. He answered questions put to him directly, confirmed facts when they were accurate, and corrected errors with the same precision he had always brought to his work. When the judge sentenced him to hang, he received the sentence without expression. Clara was not sentenced to hang. She was not sentenced to prison. She was, after 4 weeks of deliberation and testimony, and the careful consideration of her substantial cooperation, released from custody with the understanding that she would remain available to courts in other jurisdictions and would not leave the state of Missouri. The release was accompanied by conditions that amounted, in practical terms, to a cage without walls. She returned to Clearwater Hollow because she had nowhere else to go, and because some part of her, the part she was least able to explain, felt that she owed the community a presence. She did not know what that presence was supposed to accomplish. She was not forgiven. Not entirely. Not by everyone. Hannah Pruitt refused to speak to her. The Hale family allowed her to stay in a small outbuilding on their property, without warmth, but also without expulsion, which was its own complicated form of mercy. She attended the hanging in June. She stood at the back of the gathered crowd and watched Jonas Reed stand on the gallows with the same stillness he had brought to everything, looking out at the faces watching him with that quality of precise, disinterested observation that had never left him, and apparently would not leave him now. He did not make a speech. He was not offered one. After it was over, when the crowd began to move away in the particular muted dispersal of people who had witnessed something they needed time to process, Clara remained. She stood, looking at the still shape of the man she had been connected to for 9 years, through mechanisms she could no longer separate into clean categories of choice and coercion. She did not weep. She was not certain what she felt was grief. She was not certain it was relief. What it was, she thought, was knowledge. The specific, heavy weight of knowing everything about how something was built and what it cost, and where the materials came from, and finding, at the end, that understanding does not equal innocence, and that survival is not the same as redemption. She walked back toward the valley alone. The courts in Tennessee reached their own conclusions in August of that year. The warrants they issued named a woman matching Clara's description as a material participant in events in 1860, events that predated Clearwater Hollow by 2 years and involved a family whose name had appeared in the letters she wrote in January. The Missouri sheriff rode out to the Hale property on a morning in late August to execute the warrant. Clara was not there. She had been gone since the previous Thursday, taking nothing that could be traced and leaving nothing behind but a single folded page on the outbuilding's dirt floor. It was addressed to no one and signed with no name. It contained 7 lines of careful handwriting that the sheriff read twice before folding it and putting it in his coat pocket, unsure of its evidentiary value, but unable to throw it away. It said that she was sorry for what she had helped build. It said that sorry was inadequate, and she understood that. It said that she had learned from the man she had traveled with that people could be read like ledgers, could be reduced to what they owned and what they feared and what they loved. It said that she had decided she did not want to be read that way anymore, by courts or communities, or the part of herself that had spent 9 years learning to see people as resources. The last line said only this: some things end, and some things simply move to a place where you can no longer see them. The paper bore no indication of where she had gone. The mountains kept their silence. The fall came early to the Ozarks that year, settling into the hollows before September was finished, and the case was recorded in county records as resolved in the matter of Jonas Reed, and unresolved in the matter of the woman who had ridden in with the rain and left before anyone knew she was leaving, carrying something no warrant could name and no court had yet found language to address. And that is where the official record ends. But records as this story has shown, only capture what people choose to write down. And the most important truths have a way of living in the spaces between the lines, in unmarked graves and folded letters, and the memories of people who saw something in a stranger's eyes and were talked out of believing what they saw. If you have followed this story from that rainy Tuesday morning when a tired horse came down the East Ridge Trail and a calm man with a borrowed Bible smiled at a boy mending a fence, then you already understand something that the people of Clearwater Hollow learned at tremendous cost. Evil does not announce itself. It arrives with the rain and offers prayers and remembers your name and makes you feel, for the first time in a long season of fear, that someone is finally paying attention. We tell these stories because forgetting them is its own kind of danger. If this one stayed with you, if Clara's last line is still turning over in your mind, or if you find yourself wondering where she went and what she carried with her into those mountains, then tell us in the comments below. We read every one of them. And if you believe that stories like this one deserve to be heard, that the forgotten corners of American history hold truths that still matter, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. There are more hollows in these mountains, more names in ledgers no one has opened in 160 years. More mornings where someone rode in on a tired horse, and a community decided to believe what it needed to believe. We'll be back in those shadows soon. We'll be waiting for you there.